Hey guys, picture this. You're in a medieval castle, surrounded by stone walls so cold you'd swear they're trying to freeze your soul. And somehow, people managed to sleep through it without turning into human popsicles. No fancy central heating, no high-tech insulation, just fire, thick blankets, and a whole lot of luck. How did these folks survive the icy nights without losing their toes or their minds? Let me know in the comments if you've ever tried to stay cozy in winter and failed miserably. Before we dive in, hit that like button if you're curious about historical secrets, and dim the lights. Trust me, things get chillier than you expect. So grab some warm beverage, unless you're already shivering, and let's unravel the frostbitten truth of medieval castle snoozing. On a cold winter evening within the stone walls of Castle Greywatch, Sir Aldrich and his young squire, Thomas, prepared for their first deep freeze of the season. The great hall, normally warm from the hearth's faint glow, now felt stark and silent against the howling wind sneaking through narrow slit windows. As they lit their small, flickering candles, there was a quiet sense of innocence in their expectation, believing perhaps that the stone could shield them from the relentless chill outside. Little did they realize that the coming night would reveal just how much warmth had been taken for granted in the bustling days of autumn. The faint darkness settled over the cold stones, whispering that winter was no distant visitor, but a patient, silent guest. As the night deepened, the cold seeped in more insistently than anyone had feared. Sir Aldrich, trying to appear brave, wrapped himself tighter in a threadbare cloak, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the ancient castle, adjusted uncomfortably to the winter's weight. Thomas shifted nervously beside him, clutching his thin blanket and fighting the chattering of his teeth. The winds howling through the slit windows sounded almost like laughter at their failed preparations, turning what was meant to be a cozy night into a silent battle against the creeping frost. Every breath turned to mist in the air, and their half-empty chamber seemed to grow colder with each passing hour. A stark reminder that stone alone was not enough. Ironically, the castle's grandeur felt almost indifferent to their plight, a reminder of human fragility amidst the centuries-old walls. By dawn, the humor of their plight began to emerge amid the quiet misery. Thomas, eyes half shut from exhaustion, grinned faintly at his own foolishness. The castle, for all its stone and storied walls, had no special secret for keeping out the cold, only the careful stacking of logs, thick blankets, and the faintest hope. Sir Aldrich, rubbing his stiff limbs, managed a weary chuckle, acknowledging that even the strongest armor could not shield them from their own forgetfulness. They had expected stability, but in reality, winter's cold was an unpredictable guest, sneaking in where it pleased despite their best efforts. With a certain subdued acceptance, they began to plan how to better fortify their humble defenses, acknowledging that human warmth, after all, was as much about resilience as construction. Later that morning, as the sunlight timidly touched the cold stones, the castle's inhabitants settled into a calmer rhythm, adjusting their routines and shared stories of lighter days. The harsh lesson learned beneath the blanket of night became an ironic memory. How stone, no matter how grand, could not be trusted to hold warmth alone. The cold lingered in their bones, yet a peaceful understanding grew that perhaps they were more resilient than they had realized, slowly adapting to a cycle of warmth and chill. The castle, though silent and still in its own ancient way, seemed almost to breathe a quiet, enduring patience. Beyond the immediate comfort, it carried the weight of seasons passing. In this calm, there was a subtle humor, the realization that no matter how formidable a stone fortress, human warmth remains a fragile, precious thing, best preserved through patience and preparation. As dusk fell once again over Castle Greywatch, the slow hum of everyday life resumed quietly, with small tasks like stacking wood and tending to the hearth. Sir Aldrich and Tomas moved through the shadowed stone corridors, knowing that winter's tests would come again, but also that each frozen night served as a gentle reminder of their place in the endless, muted dance with the seasons. The slow passage of time imprinted in their minds that warmth was less about the castle's walls and more about their patience and humility. Such nights became quietly emblematic, a reminder that human comfort, like the stone around them, was crafted through effort and a little irony. Under the muted sky, the castle stood still, a silent witness to the simple truth. Even in stone, human resilience is a slow, gentle art taught most clearly in the quiet, cold hours between dusk and dawn. In the cool, echoing stone corridors of a medieval castle, one might imagine the quiet concern of their inhabitants as they prepared for the long, harsh winters. The thick walls, made of heavy stone, stood silently, absorbing the day's warmth, but slowly releasing it as the night deepened. Lady Elinor, the castle's steward, carefully examined the rough fabric of worn woolen blankets and the tattered edges of old tapestries, pondering how to keep the cold at bay. There was a quiet acceptance. These stones had endured centuries of weather and war, and now they needed just a little help to stay warm at night. Perhaps a blanket, or a wall hanging, or both, could turn the empty, chilly space into something slightly more bearable for those who slept within. As winter's breath seeped through every crack, the castle's residents found themselves more aware of their small, daily struggles against the cold. The servants laid out heavy layers of woven cloth on beds, tucking thick wool around their feet, all while aiming to preserve a fragile sense of comfort in the dimly lit chambers. Lady Elinor's orders to hang heavy tapestries along the cold walls were simple acts of quiet practicality. Yet they seemed almost like a tiny act of rebellion against nature's indifferent chill. The echo of footsteps on cold stone grew muffled beneath layers of fabric, and the drafts that once haunted the corridors subtly diminished, as if the tapestries and wall hangings had absorbed little pockets of warm, trapped air. In a strange twist of irony, the very defenses that protected these stone castles also made life uncomfortable. These fortress walls, once symbols of strength, now conspired with the winter's cold. The shielding tapestries, however, had a sense of unintended poetry. They transformed the loud, cavernous halls into spaces that, at least temporarily, felt subdued and somehow human. Perhaps the castle's builders, in their wisdom or neglect, failed to account for the serenity that simple cloth could bring. The hum of a spinning wheel, the crackle of a small fire, and the faint rustle of hanging tapestries became the soundtrack of evenings spent in quiet resilience rather than despair. Outside, snow pressed softly against the stone, while inside, warmth was emerging slow, imperfect, yet enough. Over time, the castle's inhabitants grew accustomed to their softer, warmer interiors. The tapestries, though simple, seemed to breathe life into the cold stones, creating a cozy cocoon within the grand structure. A shared cup of ale on a cold night, a whispered story behind the draped fabric, all became part of a slow, unspoken ritual that tethered people to their imperfect warmth. There was a certain peaceful resignation in knowing that these modest measures, a few extra layers, a hanging cloth, were all that stood between them and the biting cold of winter. The stone walls, thick and silent, carried the stories of generations who had also sought comfort in these small human acts. In the quiet, the castle's cold became less oppressive, and life, in its small, humble way, found its gentle rhythm again. Now, in the fullness of reflection, it's clear that the true warmth of the castle came less from grand design and more from human adaptation. The stone walls, once feared for their relentless cold, became part of a quiet harmony with the simple cloth and determined warmth of those inside. These modest efforts, tapestries, blankets, shared moments, highlighted the enduring ingenuity of people facing the ordinary hardships of winter. Perhaps, in the end, it was not the fortress's strength, but their own small, deliberate acts that kept the cold, at least for a while, at bay. And as the shadows lengthen and the night settles in, the castle rests quietly, a little warmer, a little wiser in its slow, patient existence within the centuries. In the quiet moments of twilight, the stone walls of the medieval castle loomed, seemingly unbothered by the biting cold that seeped through every crack. The inhabitants, noble or laborer, began to settle into their assigned chambers, aware of the emerging chill that even their thickest walls could not fully resist. As firelight dimmed, small flickers of hope sparked in their minds. Perhaps warmth could be conjured from the simple act of stacking logs or placing stones in a certain way. Most accepted that doing nothing longer than necessary was better than chasing an elusive summer's comfort inside these ancient stones. Still, a faint, shared acknowledgement lingered. Survival was often about patience, perseverance, and the quiet resistance of layers upon layers of clothing and woven blankets. As night deepened, a new tension arose. The cold refused to loosen its grip, and each breath produced a faint mist that hovered for a moment in the frosty air. The castle's master blacksmith, Garrick, had installed iron braziers in every chamber, each one softly clanking as logs were placed within and ignited, their warm glow casting gentle shadows against the rough stone. Outside, the sounds of hunters returning with pelts filled the hallways with faint rustlings and footsteps, harried, yet purposeful. The nobles and soldiers, bundled into fur cloaks and quilted blankets, huddled in their chambers, their fingers feeling the comforting weight of stitched warmth. Despite the efforts, a part of them couldn't help but feel the ironic absurdity of battling the cold with such humble, handmade defenses. Aware that nothing truly banished the chill, but the slow accumulation of layered human effort. The irony of it all was quietly amusing. These grand stone castles, symbols of power and permanence, relied on the simplest of resources: skins, furs, and flickering flames, not unlike the traditions of everyday survival. The nobility, swaddled in plush, hand-sewn blankets, often joked in muffled voices about how the only true throne was a bed layered deep with pelts, where one could finally forget the cold for a little while. Meanwhile, servant fires crackled softly in the background, their diminutive sparks barely enough to stave off the creeping frost. Hidden behind the flickering candlelight, the unseen faces of prophets or wise men were blurred by shadow, perhaps pondering the small, inevitable human dance with temperature and comfort, an ongoing, mildly humorous struggle that persisted across centuries. They had, without grandiose declarations, learned the art of enduring with endurance, calm, and a touch of domestic ingenuity. In these quiet moments, the castle's corridors seemed to breathe with a sleepy patience, embracing the slow rhythm of human resilience. The people, cloaked in their layered garments, sat often in silence, half wrapped in their blankets, as if the act of staying warm was itself an act of quiet dignity. The fires burned steadily, casting a soft glow that made their faces appear softer, friendlier, mildly amused by their own modest efforts. Occasionally, a servant would emerge with fresh pelts, or a young soldier would adjust his fur collar, each small motion contributing to the unspoken ritual of survival. There was no rush, only the slow acceptance that warmth was not perfect, but enough for now to carry on another night. In their stillness, a gentle calm seeped into the mind, lulled by the hum of life's mundane perseverance. Looking back, it's clear that these ancient efforts, layered furs, flickering fires, and the distant echoes of hunters, were more than simple solutions. They were routines fashioned from necessity and quiet hope. The castle, for all its grandeur, was just a shared shelter against the cold, inhabited by humans whose imperfections and imperfections made it all possible. They learned to accept the chill as part of the landscape, a background hum to their pursuit of daily life, with the faces of prophets long obscured by shadows and light. Perhaps, in this slow dance with cold and comfort, there was a truth. The warmth we seek is less about perfect insulation than about collective patience, small gestures, and the quiet knowledge that even the cold can be endured, one layered blanket at a time. On cold mornings, within the stone walls of the castle, the inhabitants often awoke wrapped in layers of rough wool and furs, the faint glow of firelight flickering on their tired faces. The great hall, with its towering beams and heavy tapestries, was a sanctuary from the biting winter outside. Yet the air still carried a chill that seeped through cracks and thin blankets. As dawn approached, the lord of the castle gathered his retinue to consider the lingering cold that refused to yield. There was a quiet recognition that these winters, with their unpredictable sharpness, tested the simplicity of their stone refuge and daily routines. Still, with patience and shared effort, they endured, counting on the familiarity of this slow, steady survival. One particularly harsh morning, an unexpected Arctic front had descended, freezing the castle's outer moat and snarling the supply lines of firewood and fresh provisions. The warmth that used to fill the hall now felt distant, as the usual supplies seemed insufficient to combat both the cold and the growing anxiety. Sir Aldrich, a man known more for his patience than his flair, called for an emergency assembly. Gestures deliberate and calm amidst the rising quiet tension, the servants scurried about, clutching clay pots filled with hot water, trying to warm the flagstones and stave off the bitter chill. Outside, the wind howled along the battlements, indifferent to human efforts, as everyone faced the quiet dilemma of winter's stubborn grip. There was an ironic stillness to the scene, as the castle's inhabitants reconvened to share a modest feast that had momentarily turned into their only warmth. A huge spit turned slowly over a roaring fire, meat crackling softly in the smoky air, the aroma drifting through the cold halls with a strange, grounding familiarity. The people gathered around, some sitting on benches, some standing with mugs of ale, all watching the steady rotation of the food and the flickering shadows cast by the fire. The servants circulated with clay pots, pouring steaming water onto the cold stones, whispering quiet reassurances that, somehow, warmth was being preserved. A fragile, collective effort stubbornly kept alive by patience and mundane ritual. The absurdity was in how much effort it took simply to keep from freezing. Yet they persisted without expectation of grandeur. As the day grew longer, a calm settled over the castle, the immediate crisis giving way to quiet routine and gentle acceptance. The stone floors, warmed a little by the circulating water, felt softer underfoot, and the distant sizzle of the roasting meat became a slow, comforting background sound. The people found a gentle rhythm. Servants refilled clay pots. The Lord looked out the narrow window at the snow-covered courtyard, and children chuckled softly, muffled by their layers. In this pause, the cold no longer felt quite so sharp, replaced by a shared sense of resilience rooted in simple, daily acts. The scene was ordinary in its quiet endurance, the kind of stillness that only winter can impose, inviting reflection rather than despair. In the soft shadows of the evening, as exhaustion and satisfaction mingled, the castle's people quietly acknowledged that survival did not always mean comfort, but rather a slow, collective patience that carried them through the cold. The blurred faces of prophets and rulers seemed distant, unneeded in this shared respite, where the true miracle was their ability to adapt gracefully to the icy silence outside. Later, as candles flickered and sleep crept upon them, the castle quietly rested, warmed fractionally by their small efforts, an unspoken reminder that even in the dull certainty of winter, human persistence quietly endured. It was a story of modest effort, simple routines, and the unremarkable beauty of just waiting for spring. As dawn crept over the stone battlements, the castle slowly stirred from its frigid silence. Shadows still clung to the corners of the great hall, where a faint flicker from a brazier suggested last night's efforts had kept the cold at bay. Thick tapestries, woven tightly and hung carefully across the walls, absorbed the lingering chill, cocooning the sleeping chambers in warmth that was more illusion than substance. Despite the unyielding stones, The inhabitants had learned to find comfort in these small, familiar protections, furs piled high. The crackle of burning logs and murmured voices that offered reassurance in the early light. And so, over time, these modest strategies folded themselves into the daily rhythm, becoming a quiet tradition of survival in winter's grasp. Yet, as morning stretched on, the subtle tension in the air revealed itself. The stones remained cold, sending faint drafts through any unsealed crevice. The warmth from the brazier was now distant, its glow insufficient against the relentless chill. The servants moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, as they added more firewood or adjusted the furs on beds. It was a fragile, ongoing negotiation between human effort and the unforgiving stone beneath, a dance of patience and persistence. The castle, still deeply asleep beneath layers of warmth and gloom, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for that elusive moment when the day's sun might coax a tiny thaw from the winter air outside. Sometimes it was almost humorous how seriously everyone took the small victories, like finally feeling a hand warm after hours of numbness, or the faint scent of heated tallow after a quick relight of the brazier. Fool's gold, perhaps, but comfort nonetheless. Prophets, whose faces remained unseen behind the diffused glow of morning, had long ago lost their influence over the stone-hard realities inside the castle walls. Their shadowy, blurred faces seemed to hint that some secrets of warmth and survival remained hidden in the unseen, silent corners of history. How strange that such modest efforts, draped tapestries, glowing embers, and thick animal pelts became the rituals that carried everyone through long, cold nights without freezing to death. A quiet irony couched in human resilience. As the sun gradually inched higher, a gentle warmth seeped into the stone corridors, softening the sharp edges of winter's grasp. The cold was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but the castle's inhabitants nodded off again, comforted by the faint, steady hum of roasting fires and warm breath escaping into the chilly air. They understood, perhaps more than most, that survival was a series of gentle, incremental wins, adding one layer of warmth after another, rather than a single act of triumph. The morning sun's slow ascent promised more warmth ahead. Yet beneath that promise, the castle endured the quiet surrender to a colder season. Here, in this moment of calm, routine persisted quietly as the stone walls held on, uncomplaining. Looking back, it seems almost poignant how these everyday precautions, tapestries, fires, furs, paint a picture of humble perseverance. The castle's silent stones had learned to coexist with human imperfection, embracing the slow, unglamorous process of staying alive through cold nights. Prophets' faces, once blurred in the flickering torchlight, remained unspoken symbols of hope. Yet it was always the simple acts, feeding the fire, adjusting the furs, that truly kept everyone warm. There, in the quiet struggle against winter, was a strange kind of peace, a reminder that survival often depended on patience and small, familiar rituals. Perhaps, in some unseen way, these modest efforts made the cold more bearable, weaving a subtle fabric of resilience through centuries of darkness and frost. In the quiet corners of the castle bedroom, the fireplace's warm glow offered more than comfort. It served as a constant reminder of the hearth's quiet importance. Each evening, as the flames flickered and cast playful shadows, the chamber's occupants often found themselves lost in the soft crackling sounds, or in whispered conversations about the day's small affairs. The smoke from the fire, almost invisible at first, seemed to drift lazily upward, unnoticed by most, but subtly revealing hidden passages and secret corners to the observant. For Elinor and Aldrich, the hearth was both centerpiece and confidant, quietly observing the mundane human endeavors that unfolded on its warm stones. As winter deepened, the hearth's role shifted subtly from mere heat provider to chosen stage for gossip and veiled intrigue. The rising smoke occasionally curled in peculiar patterns that some believed hinted at secrets hidden beneath the castle's ancient stones. One chilly evening, a sudden draft from an old, partially blocked chimney caused a small panic. The flames danced unpredictably, and pale tapestries shivered behind their frames, threatening to hide misdeeds in their worn fabric. Aldrich, ever the pragmatist, began contemplating ways to reinforce the hearth's ventilation, wary of how a misjudged gust might choke the room's life out of its fragile tapestries and fragile peace. It was, after all, a quiet reminder that even the simplest of comforts could harbor unforeseen discomforts. The irony of the situation was not lost on Elinor, who, with a faint smirk, watched Aldrich struggle to fashion a makeshift chimney grate from scrap metal and old cloth. Their attempts, clumsy and eager, exemplified the often imperfect human effort to control nature's slow, insistent tendencies. Smoke still found its way into unexpected corners, curling briefly over the crackling fire and settling like a small, invisible burden. The tapestries, once pristine, now bore faint smudges of soot, a testament to human persistence and their slight irony that even well-placed shields could not entirely block the whims of wind or smoke. Yet amidst these small failures, there was a gentle patience that lingered quiet and undisturbed, a human acceptance of their own imperfection. Quiet gradually settled back over the room, the fire's glow softening as the draught was tamed, and the tapestries dried slowly in the warm, stale air. Elinor traced the rough-hewn edges of the new grate, her fingertips feeling the cool, uneven metal, while Aldrich whispered softly to himself about future adjustments. In time, the smoke ceased to whisper secrets, becoming a mere background thread in their nightly ritual. The room found its stillness, the small community of old stones, flickering fire, and tired human faces settling into a calm rhythm. The castle's ancient walls seemed to exhale softly, accepting again the mundane peace of slow, human life, laced with small, humorous struggles that belonged quietly to the past and present alike. Looking back, the hearth's modest role in that winter's story seemed both trivial and significant. A small human effort to tame fire and air, to safeguard their fragile possessions, and to preserve a semblance of warmth. It was a reminder that, in the slow, steady passage of seasons and stories, our imperfections often weave a gentle, unnoticed richness into the fabric of everyday life. The smoke that once revealed secrets now drifted benignly upward, blending with the muted light of a fading day. As Elinor and Aldrich finally settled into quiet repose, the castle, with its battered tapestries and stubborn chimneys, continued its quiet watch. A silent, softly humorous witness to human resilience amid small imperfections. In the dim glow of the chamber, the castle's bedroom hearth flickered softly, its stones warm and familiar amidst the quiet sounds of nightly breathing. The bed was made with simple, heavy fabrics, and the air carried a faint scent of wood smoke mingled with linen. It was a place of rest, grounded in routine, where the gentle crackle of the fire kept the shadows at bay, and whispers of history felt a little less distant. Outside, the distant call of guards and the whisper of wind through stone walls seemed to pause, as if the castle itself was listening to the comforting rhythm of the hearth's glow. It was unremarkable, perhaps, but in those flickering moments, life was quietly assured, steady and slow, like the gentle passing of another day's end. Then came the sudden stillness, an alarm that rippled through the walls, a sudden, tense silence interrupted only by hurried footsteps and muffled voices. The rival lord had laid siege, encircling the castle with a quiet but persistent threat. The defenders knew their resources, especially the warmth and well-being of the wounded, depended on the hearth's unyielding heat. The servants and soldiers, in a slow, resigned motion, turned to the hearth not for fire alone, but for urgency. Its sturdy stones repurposed, shifted, and molded into crude tools and makeshift shields. The familiar crackling was replaced by silence, broken only by cautious whispers and the faint scrape of stone on stone. The hearth became a test of resilience, a fragile link between comfort and chaos, momentarily strained under the weight of conflict. In the quiet hours that followed, irony settled quietly like dust. What had once been a symbol of warmth now strained under the weight of necessity. The same stones that once radiated gentle heat now bore the rough edges of implements crafted amidst hurried labor. The crackle of the fire was gone, replaced by the steady hum of human effort. The castle's staff, unshaken but weary, watched as the hearth's depths held the fragile promise of warmth, even as the walls outside remained silent and still. Perhaps, in some distant, blurred corner of shadowed memories, no one knew whether the old stones had held or broken, only that survival had become an act of quietly adaptable ingenuity, woven into the fabric of everyday endurance. And somewhere in that low hum of action, life lingered, imperfect and unpretentious. As dawn edged softly into the chamber, the hearth stones cooled, and the castle's rhythmic calm returned, like a slow exhale after the night's quiet storm. The servants resumed their tasks with a measured patience, reshaping the stones back into hearth depths, now less pristine, more worn, but still capable of warmth, perhaps a little more reluctant than before. The wounded, now tended, rested quietly, wrapped not just in blankets, but in the shared understanding of human fragility and resilience. Outside, the castle stood silent and unbowed, waiting, as castles often do, for the next small moment to slip by unnoticed. The hearth, once again a simple fixture, quietly reminded everyone that even in conflict, life persisted in the smallest, most mundane ways, calm, patient, undramatic. In reflection, the story of that hearth and those stones feels like a small chapter in a long, slow narrative, one that speaks to human imperfection and the gentle persistence of daily life. When moments of crisis pass, life often returns to its quiet routines, accepting the cracks and the wear with a peculiar grace. The castle's ancient stones, blurred in memory and shadowed in light, continue their silent vigil, unpretentious, enduring, oddly humorous in their quiet loyalty to human comfort. Here, amid the mundane, history gently breathes in the crackling silence of a hearth, in the soft, tired faces of those who wait, and in the slow, calm flow of life's inevitable wear. Perhaps, in these small acts of enduring, there is a lesson worth quietly pondering before sleep's gentle embrace takes hold. In the quiet stillness of a medieval castle's chamber, the hearth's gentle glow was a familiar comfort, crackling softly as logs settled into embers. The room's stone walls seemed to breathe with the warmth, and the distant rain tapped a slow rhythm on the high, narrow windows. It was a moment of ordinary peace, where the flicker of flames offered both light and a sense of stability amidst the slow passage of time. Elinor, seated nearby with her hands in her lap, watched the fire with a kind of accepting patience, knowing that this simple warmth was a quiet miracle of human craftsmanship. The hearth, usually a symbol of daily life's quiet persistence, seemed almost impervious to the world's endless motion, holding on with familiar, unhurried patience. Then, as midnight wore on, thunder rumbled low and distant, growing louder and closer without warning. The storm's fury was unforgiving. Lightning tore through the sky with a sudden blaze that briefly flooded the chamber in unnatural white light. An almost imperceptible cracking sound preceded a burst of heat. Metal fittings around the hearth had been struck, and sparks leapt into the air, setting the ironwork aflame. Elinor's heart paused for a moment, startled by the destructive quickness of nature's unexpected assault. The flames flickered fiercely, ignoring her efforts to contain them, and the room seemed to lean in, holding its breath as danger spread silently toward the royal apartments. Irony flickered in her mind. The familiar comfort of fire was now threatening to turn the castle's heart to ash. Amid the crackling chaos, a quiet voice inside her reminded her of Aldrich's lessons, how fire could be a friend if understood well enough to tame it. Elinor's hands trembled slightly, yet within her was a calm she had learned from cautious study and patient observation. She reached for the long, iron-tipped poker beside her, carefully positioning the glowing embers and spreading the flames away from the wooden walls. A faint, almost amused smile touched her lips. How often was it that humans learned to wrestle with something so elemental, so inherently unpredictable, and yet so vital? Slowly, the roaring blaze began to settle into a more manageable glow. The threat to the castle's core was contained, if only just, and a delicate balance was restored. The storm outside raged on, but inside the chamber, a strange serenity returned, born of quiet effort and learned restraint. As dawn approached, the storm waned into a distant rinse of rain and wind that now carried only muted whispers through the stone corridors. Elinor, weary but composed, watched the fire gradually diminish to a gentle bed of coals, their warmth still faintly radiating into the cool air. The castle's heartbeat, muted for a moment, resumed its slow, steady rhythm. Her mind lingered on the strange irony of the night, how a force as fierce as lightning and fire could be held back by mere knowledge and patience. The castle, with all its thick stones and quiet corridors, seemed partly a relic of human humility, enduring yet vulnerable. In the moment of calm, she gently stacked fresh logs, understanding that each day's small acts of care kept the fires and the hopes within these walls alive. Later, as her thoughts drifted over the quiet castle, it was clear that the hearth had once again demonstrated its quiet power, not just as a source of warmth, but as a symbol of resilience in the mundane. The night's fury had shown how fragile comfort could be, yet also how strength lay in understanding and restraint. Castles might seem eternal, but they relied on the simple, ongoing human act of tending the hearth with care and quiet humility. Elinor's gaze lingered on the fading coals, recalling the fleeting, almost humorous truth that in the midst of life's chaos, it's often the slow, deliberate actions, like tending fire, that keep everything from falling apart. The castle's pulse persisted, steady as ever, as daybreak washed softly over the stone and timber, whispering of another calm day to come. In the dim light of late afternoon, the castle's bedroom lay quietly awaiting the return of its inhabitants. Once, the hearth's crackling fire had been a central, reliable warmth that filled the space with flickering shadows and gentle smoke. The stones beneath the primed hearth showed faint marks of hurried rebuilding, a quiet testament to the castle's resilience. For a time, the hearth was all but forgotten, cold and silent, a symbol of the siege's intrusion into daily life. Yet, as the threat waned, the stonework was carefully renewed, and a vaulted chimney was constructed, restoring the room's humble sanctuary of heat and light. With the walls of the castle steadied and the siege lifted, the castle's master ordered the hearth rebuilt. Heavy stones were laid, carefully fitted, to create a robust foundation that could withstand both winter's chill and passing years. The new chimney curved gracefully upward, carrying the smoke away in a slow, whispering trail. The fireplace, once an ordinary feature, thus became a sign of silent endurance, a small monument to perseverance amid uncertainties. The hearth's slow restoration seemed almost contemplative, as if the castle itself was quietly reaffirming its most basic purpose: protection through comfort, unity through warmth. Ironically, this careful renewal also highlighted how easily human routines could be forgotten or taken for granted until the fire was finally stoked again. The familiar smell of burning wood floated through the corridor, stirring a faint smile on the faces of the castle staff, who had long since grown used to the quiet steadiness of the flames. Once, prophets and spiritual figures had spoken in shadowed corners, their faces blurred by unseen light. Yet here, the fire's glow made everything seem more visible, more tangible. The sleeping stones below the mantel remembered the small, ordinary acts of polishing and tending that kept the hearth alive, acts that seemed mundane, but were essential for the castle's rhythm. Now, the castle's bedside rooms, once cold and moldy, were transformed into warm sanctuaries, each with its own modest hearth radiating gentle heat. The flickering glow served as a reassuring reminder that even statuesque stones and silent walls could harbor a quiet, flickering life. The fire's steady rhythm, like a slow heartbeat, synchronized with the hum of daily human affairs, an invisible thread tying the past to the present. The rooms, sparse and simple, fostered peace over grandeur, and the quiet patience of the castle seemed to settle into the warm corners with a soft, almost humorous acceptance of their own imperfection. Life, after all, persisted in small, focused moments of comfort. Looking back, one might see the hearth's reconstruction not merely as a practical task, but as a modest act of resilience, an acknowledgement of human needs amid the vast, indifferent stone walls. The shadowed faces of prophets and figures of authority remained invisible, yet their silent influence lingered in the careful craftsmanship of the chimney and hearth. Today, the castle's bedrooms are quiet, filled with the gentle glow of fires long burned down, forever echoing the quiet, ongoing testament to human adaptability. The warmth of the hearth, once restored amid noise and chaos, now whispers calmly of security and the unspoken comfort of home, reminders that even in forgotten, battered places, life finds a way to settle back into gentle routines. On a quiet morning in the 12th century, Master Mason Aldrich stood beside the looming stone walls of Castle Thornwick, surveying the heavy, cold stones that seemed indifferent to warmth. Lady Aloin, standing nearby with a wrinkle of concern shadowing her brow, voiced her worry that the thick walls, while formidable, might trap the cold inside during winter, turning the great hall into an uninviting icebox. Aldrich, whose hands had known mortar and brick, but not yet the secrets of true insulation, nodded slowly, listening not just to her words, but to the faint, distant shiver of the stones themselves. It was a moment of quiet tension, where human care met ancient stone, both seemingly just waiting for winter's inevitable visit. The air was tinged with the scent of dampness and old wood, settling into the rhythm of unspoken questions about warmth and survival. As the days grew colder, Aldrich began to ponder the old stories whispered by traveling builders, stories of strange materials and forgotten methods that might hold the heat longer. The stones, thick and seemingly indifferent, did little to resist the chilling touch of winter. A draft crept along the mortar joints, and the shared warmth of the hearth seemed destined to escape through minute cracks. Lady Aloin's quiet sighs became part of the morning ritual. Her concern for her household's comfort flickering like the dying embers in the hearth. Aldrich, feeling the weight off his responsibility, started experimenting with the scarce materials available: layered straw, loose earth, even bits of wool, trying to outsmart the relentless cold. Yet each attempt subtly revealed the stubbornness of stone and the limits of human ingenuity in the face of natural indifference. In the stillness of a late afternoon, Aldrich's efforts seemed almost comically small against the vast, unyielding walls. He secretly chuckled at the idea that woven straw or mud could truly make a difference. Lady Aloan, watching from a shadowed corner, seemed to think the same. Her face, softly illuminated by the weak sun, blurred into a gentle, amused mask of skepticism. The irony hung quietly in the space between them. No matter how much they layered and patched, the stones remained steadfastly silent about their warmth, offering only a cool, unchanging presence. Aldrich's experiments might have been humble and modest, but they carried the faint hope of keeping a flicker of human warmth alive inside the castle. Even these small acts felt like a gentle rebellion against the impossible chill that seeped through centuries of stone. One evening, as the fire crackled softly and shadows lengthened, Aldrich finally accepted the quiet truth that the walls, for all their weight and age, held only so much warmth naturally. With a gentle resignation, he began to see the insulation not just as a practical challenge, but as an ongoing, gentle dance with history itself, acknowledging that human efforts to hold warmth were always partial, always humble. Lady Aloan, now more at ease, observed the slow accumulation of small improvements: the modest addition of straw packing here, a bit of clay ceiling there, each change a small, quiet gesture towards comfort. The castle, in its silent, stoic way, continued to be both a refuge and a reminder of human imperfection, persistent, imperfect, and quietly hopeful. The cold persisted outside, but inside, life adaptively carried on, softly resisting the inevitable winter's claim. Looking back from a distance of centuries, the story of Castle Thornwick's walls is a humble testament to human resilience. A series of tiny, imperfect acts stitched together like the loose layers of insulation, each one a quiet acknowledgement that warmth is never fully owned by stone or mortar, but rather a fragile gift passed quietly from human hand to space. Lady Aloan's worries faded into the mist of history, replaced by a gentle, enduring understanding that comfort is often built through patience and small, recurring efforts. Aldrich's modest experiments, now woven into the memory of the castle, serve as a reminder that even the coldest stones can be softened, ever so slightly, by human care, if only in small, slow moments of persistence. And so the walls remained, stoic, yet subtly warmed by the knowledge that, in the end, there is a quiet warmth in trying, lingering just beneath the surface of stone and story. Long ago, in a quiet corner of history, builders and monks alike observed how the stone walls of their castles and monasteries gradually cooled overnight, their surfaces cool and unyielding under the dim light of dawn. It was a subtle realization. Warmth persisted less from the stones themselves than from what was hidden within. A simple layer of bundled wool, mixed with straw and horsehair, pressed between the rough exterior and the timber core inside. Aldrich, traveling through distant lands, touched the coarse fabric of these packed insulations, feeling the gentle trap of warm air against his fingertips, like a faint, soft breath of life between heavy stones. The idea was humble yet profound. Insulation was a matter of quiet, layered human effort, not grand invention, but careful, knowing layering. As he observed, the constant patience of this small craft made him think of how humans had always sought to capture fleeting warmth in modest, unremarkable ways. Yet as seasons turned, the warmth of these layered walls became a quiet tension, sometimes too much, sometimes too little. The monks, with their routines of patching and stuffing, knew well the subtle dance of moisture and heat. The wool, straw, and horsehair harbored their own quiet stories, absorbing dampness during the humid days and releasing it slowly as the cold nights drew near. Perhaps it was irony that so much of their effort looked like little more than patchwork, an unassuming mosaic of fibers, yet it served as a delicate barrier, keeping the chill at bay and the moisture out. Aldrich watched a monk carefully fashion a new bundle, the fibers shifting softly in his hands, knowing that even this simple act was a small act of defiance against nature's persistent chill. Stitched together in silence and patience. In time, Aldrich noticed that, as often happens, routine craftsmanship carried its own quiet humor, how these bundles, despite their purpose, could seem so plainly unimpressive, like clumps of wool left forgotten on a humble bench. It wasn't a grand story of invention, but a testament to modest persistence. Stacking and stuffing, layer after layer, in a slow, unperturbed effort that, frankly, could be mistaken for neglect rather than care. A sheared sheep's fleece, mixed with straw and horsehair, sat in a corner, overlooked except by those who knew its role. The irony lingered. The warmth was built from what was discarded or unloved, materials humble enough to be dismissed, but central to the quiet resilience of these thick stone walls. Eventually, Aldrich found himself contemplating the stillness of these insulations, how tiny air pockets trapped within fiber bundles created a natural, breathable buffer that mattered little in grand design, but everything in daily life. The layers settled gently, year after year, in a silent rhythm of patching and renewal, becoming part of the stone and timber landscape. He saw the monks sitting quietly near fires, wrapped in simple cloaks, aware of the thermal cocoon they helped maintain with every patch and every careful adjustment. The warmth was neither miraculous nor dramatic, but a steady, soft presence, like the quiet heartbeat of a building that had stored centuries of human patience and modest ingenuity. There was comfort in knowing that such small, routine acts sustained the slow flow of daily life. In the end, Aldrich understood that this story was not one of clever innovations, but of humble, ongoing human effort, layer upon layer of care, woven into the fabric of their stone homes. The wool, straw, and horsehair quietly fulfilled their purpose, reminding him that warmth was a shared human achievement, built not by grand gestures, but through simple, persistent acts. The blurred faces of monks and builders, gentle and unassuming, sat beside their layered walls, silent witnesses to a slow, enduring reliance on modest materials assembled with patience. As evening fell, the entire scene felt deeply grounded, a reminder that comfort and warmth often rested in the everyday routines that no one formally celebrated, but everyone relied upon, quietly, faithfully, enduringly. Long ago, in a quiet stone fortress called Thornwick, a mason carefully laid the first stones of the castle's thick walls. There was a certain quiet pride in the weight of each block and the way they held the distant sky. The early mornings were filled with the soft sound of chisel and hammer as he measured and fitted, making sure the walls stood firm and silent against the cold whispers of winter winds. It was an ordinary craft, yet beneath it lay a subtle aspiration to keep the warmth inside and block out the relentless chill outside, all in a landscape that seemed content to remain unchanged. The builders understood, perhaps unconsciously, that their work was less about grandeur and more about quiet resilience, keeping the cold at bay through patience and careful planning. And so, the walls rose slowly, like silent guardians of warmth, waiting for the day when humans would rest behind their sturdy shelter, unaware of the small, unseen effort that made such comfort possible. As autumn gave way to winter, the castle's outer face remained steadfast, but behind the scenes, the mason pondered how to improve this seemingly impenetrable barrier. The cold slipped through even the tightest stones, a fact that bothered him without fuss or frustration. Inspired by some old idea, perhaps borrowed from neighbors or ancient texts, he decided to add a space between two stone faces, a small groove that might trap the cold or slow it down. He kept the design simple, filling the narrow cavity with crushed charcoal and dry lime, materials that felt more like experiments than certainty. There was a faint irony in how such modest additions could make the difference between a cold den and a warm refuge. Still, the construction process moved forward, slow, deliberate. A quiet dance of stones and powders, each step echoing the unspoken belief that maybe, just maybe, warmth could be held closer, even in the hardest of winters. By the time winter deepened, the castle's double wall stood as a curious secret, half hidden, half exposed. The villagers seldom noticed the modest cavity as they went about their routines. The mason smiled quietly at his work, an admittedly small comfort, yet realized that in some way it was also a kind of silent rebellion against the cold. The crushed charcoal inside the gap shimmered faintly in the firelight, strangely poetic amidst the rough stone. It was as if an unspoken joke lurked in the layers, a cryptic statement about human effort's humble reach. The cold outside still pressed, but its impact was subtly softened by this simple shelter, an invisible boundary that resisted the slipping, icy hand of winter. And in those quiet moments, the castle's walls seemed to whisper their own unpretentious story of survival. Nestled in the mundane sincerity of stone and powder, with winter settling into its deep, calm stretch, the castle's walls carried their secret comfortably. And perhaps so did the mason, who took small comfort in the slow, steady work of shaping shelter. Life moved on with the faint sound of footsteps, the crackle of fires, and the soft murmur of villagers wrapped in wool. The warmth inside was a subtle relief, not grand, but essential. He often paused to look at the thick, unassuming walls, feeling a quiet sense of calm, an acknowledgement that simple measures tend to endure, even if they are hardly noticed. The blurred faces of distant figures, seen briefly in the half-light, seemed to pass by the castle as mere shadows, unaware of the subtle irony that warmth was partly secured by things as humble as crushed charcoal and dry lime. It struck him in a small way how the human effort to stay warm was always a quiet, ongoing conversation with nature, imperfect, modest, and quietly persistent. Years later, as time tumbled quietly onward, the castle's double wall remained, a humble monument to human ingenuity wrapped in everyday materials. The story of warmth and cold, of stones and powders, felt distant, yet somehow eternal. The mason's simple idea had become just another part of the slow, endless work of human shelter, an ordinary, unremarkable act that nonetheless kept many warm. Looking back, he might have chuckled at the modesty of his solution, knowing it was neither elegant nor foolproof, but all the more human for that. The slow rhythm of daily life continued, people talking, working, resting within walls that had seen centuries of quiet effort, and somewhere in the shadows of time, perhaps a prophet or healer's face remained blurred, their presence a faint reminder that even in our attempts to safeguard ourselves, a little mystery, a little irony, always lingers beneath the surface of warmth and stone. In the quiet glow of a winter evening, the castle's stone walls stood silent, thick, unyielding, and yet quietly vulnerable to the creeping cold outside. Inside, the small flicker of a hearth cast gentle shadows on faces that had seen many seasons pass, their expressions reflecting both acceptance and routine. The soldiers and townsfolk settled into their routines, stacking logs and tending fires, as the wind outside moaned softly through narrow cracks. Indifferent to human effort, it was a season when warmth depended not on magic, but on simple layers, woolen cloaks, thick walls, and the steady rhythm of daily chores. Human endurance, perhaps, was as insubstantial as the smoke curling upward, yet somehow enough to carry them through another winter's night with patience and quiet hope. As the harsh winter siege tightened its grip, the cold seeped into every crevice, and the castle's thick double walls creaked beneath the weight of snow and wind. Inside, the great hall pulsed with the glow of massive hearths, their flames flickering valiantly against the darkness outside, an unspoken promise of warmth amid the encroaching cold. The defenders crowded close around the fires, their faces blurred and hidden by shadows, listening to the crackle of burning wood and the distant howl of winter's breath. The snow pressed against the stone walls, as if trying to force its way inside, yet the layers of wool and packed earth held firm, their insulating purpose quietly asserting itself. There was a strange, solemn irony in the scene. The warmth of the hearths serving as both sanctuary and a reminder of fragile human effort against the vast, indifferent cold. Outside, the flickering torches of the besiegers danced against the night, their flames briefly illuminating the icy silhouettes of soldiers and siege engines, only to vanish into the darkness again. Inside, the warmth from the hearths created a small world apart, one where our ancestors seemed to forget the biting wind, or perhaps simply learned to ignore it, to preserve the sense of life and hope within. The layered stone, wool-filled chambers, and the careful arrangement of fire and air acted like a quiet guardian of life. Proof that human ingenuity was often about small, persistent acts rather than grand gestures. An unintentional irony hung in the air. as much as the enemy's fires flickered with menace outside. It was the humble, well-insulated interior that kept the castle's heart beating, slow and steady, through the long night. As dawn crept quietly over the snow-covered battlements, the castle remained still and warm. The fires continued to burn softly, undisturbed by the cold still lingering beyond the walls. The defenders, now weary but safe, moved with gentle routines, stoking the fires, sharing bread, and gazing out through narrow slits at the winter landscape. The blurred faces, turned slightly in their small world of warmth and frayed cloth, seemed to take comfort in the quiet resilience of their simple insulation techniques. Thick walls, insulating wool, and well-kept fires. Outside, the snow remained untouched and silent, a sterile witness to the quiet victory of basic human craftsmanship. It was a patience that needed no celebration, only quiet continuation, in the way that castles stood stoically, year after year, winter after winter. Now, looking back through the slow lens of history, it is clear that the true lesson was in the implicit humility of these efforts, an understanding that warmth, like many human pursuits, relies on layers of small, often unnoticed things: the stone walls, the woolen cloaks, the careful tending of fires, each a tiny act of defiance against the cold, stitched into the fabric of daily life. The faces blurred by time and distance remind us that human resilience is built on many such moments of quiet, steady labor. Beneath the tired, muted light of a long winter's dawn, the castle's walls held firm, not just against the cold, but as silent witnesses to the enduring patience of those who built, maintained, and simply endured. In these slow stories, perhaps, we learn most about the unspoken strength of everyday human life, moderate, imperfect, and quietly ongoing. Long ago, in the quiet shadowed halls of Thornwick Castle, the stone walls held secrets of warmth. As winter's chill crept through the cracks, villagers watched the stones, unassuming yet quietly resilient. Lady Aloan, curious and somewhat weary from the endless cold, commissioned a simple chronicle, an account of how their ancient walls managed to hold their heat. The stones, dull and unremarkable by daylight, whispered stories of centuries past, when humans learned to craft with patience, layering mud, straw, and ash into the gaps. It was an unpretentious magic, stitched into their everyday lives, barely noticed, but endlessly relied upon. Over time, the castle's defenses and insulations became a matter of quiet tension. Could the stones truly keep out the winter's relentless fingers? Scholars, decades later, studied the thick walls with tired eyes, marveling at their complexity born from trial and error. Their measurements revealed tiny variations, how air pockets trapped heat, how uneven mortar dried with a slight warmth. Yet, amidst the scholarly charts, there was a faint irony. What seemed rough and makeshift in ancient times was, in fact, a masterful response to simple human failure at perfect construction. The castle's walls, clumsy yet clever, silently endured generations of cold with stubborn, unspoken humor. In examining these relics, researchers sometimes chuckled at the paradox. These ancient insulations, designed long ago without modern science, harbored humility and human imperfection. The thick walls, patched and repatched through centuries, carried a quiet wit. Their very flaws contributed to their warmth. As the light waned and dust settled on ancient sketches, the realization dawned that centuries of making do had fused into a kind of rustic wisdom. The insulations, built by hands weary but imaginative, demonstrated that a little imperfection, carefully layered, could serve a purpose that no perfect design had managed. Today, the soft hum of modern sustainability echoes some of those old, unintentional lessons. Contemporary builders, examining Thornwick's walls, find solace in their gentle ingenuity. The silent stones remind us that warmth need not come from high-tech gadgets, but from slow, deliberate human care. In the quiet hours of the modern day, as homes seek to mimic these ancient insulations, there is a peaceful recognition, the subtle strength of simplicity, and the humble bravery of people who layered mud and straw with little fanfare, but great intent. Somewhere in the calm routine of daily life, the whisper of that old stone secret persists, almost forgotten, yet quietly essential. Reflecting on these enduring walls, it's easy to feel a quiet kinship with those distant builders, tired yet hopeful, imperfect yet resilient. Lady Alohan's simple chronicle, once a mundane record, now bears a gentle dignity, a testament to human persistence, fashioned in stone and mortar. Those ancient walls, worn and cracked over centuries, serve as a modest reminder that the warmth we seek is often rooted in small, honest efforts that meld into lasting legacies. As sleep approaches, one might wonder if, in some subtle way, we all carry fragments of those warm stones within us, simple layers of care built over time, quietly holding the cold at bay. In the quiet folds of a modest 12th century manor, young Aldrich's first encounter with a bed involved the simple, fragile bundle of straw that made up his sleeping space. It was a humble beginning, with coarse reeds pressed together, offering little more than a slightly softer place to rest than the cold, hard floor below. As he hesitated upon it for the first time, he could feel the roughness prickling through his thin linen gown, and he wondered how such a sparse mattress could hold the weight of dreams or worries alike. Nightly, he learned that comfort was an offering, not a birthright. It was woven into the rough texture of straw and the faint scent of dried hay. In this quiet ritual, the bed was less a throne of luxury and more a daily gift, a simple boundary between waking life and the silence of sleep. Over time, as Aldrich grew more accustomed, he began to sense the subtle tension in the air each night, as the straw crunched softly beneath him, a constant reminder of his status within the manor's modest hierarchy. For some, the straw mattress was a signal of modest rank, a humble necessity acquired through labor and patience. Yet, for others, the quality or freshness of this bundle could speak quietly of wealth, or at least a desire for the illusion of comfort amid the austerity. The occasional shift of the straw, its crinkling and settling with each restless movement, became part of the nightly rhythm, an unspoken conversation between human effort and natural materials. In the coldness of dawn, Aldrich would sometimes pause, pondering how such a fragile landscape of reeds could carry his fleeting dreams into the faint light of morning. There was a quiet irony in how many believed the straw bed was the pinnacle of medieval comfort, when in truth it was perhaps the least forgiving of all clumsy, scratchy, and unrefined. Every day, around the hearth, tailies would drift about the latest luxury, feather-lined bedding imported from distant lands. Yet, amidst these whispers, the straw remained the silent, enduring staple. Aldrich chuckled softly to himself one night, feeling the slight poke of an especially stubborn straw sticking through, as if mocking the idea that such simplicity could wield any true softness. The absurdity was undeniable. In pursuit of finer things, the humble straw still bore the weight of expectation. Yet nobody was quite deceived about its rough nature. It was a quiet, honest reminder that comfort, and perhaps happiness, was often just a layer of illusion on a bed of reeds. As seasons turned and nights grew colder, the straw mattress became a familiar, if unremarkable, companion, its roughness softened in memory rather than substance. Aldrich's eyes, now heavier, saw the simple bed as more than a piece of furniture. It was a witness to countless small struggles, quiet hopes, and the daily rhythm of life in the manor. Though modest, the straw bed carried the weight of human imperfection with gentle patience, its thin, bristly surface a testament to resilience, humility, and the unspoken dignity in simply lying down. Peace settled in the faint crinkle of straw, the whisper of breath on rough fibers, and the slow, measured heartbeat of a life bound to humble beginnings. Sometimes he wondered if the real comfort was in accepting the roughness rather than seeking to erase it, in finding calm in the simple act of sleep. Now, as years pass, and the memory of straw mattresses remains quietly embedded in history's distant hum, Aldrich's story echoes the timeless subtext of such humble beginnings. He learned that comfort was never purely in the materials, nor in the status they conferred, but in the quiet acceptance of life's imperfect layers. The humble straw bed, once a feature of modest life, had subtly woven itself into the fabric of human endurance and unpretentious grace. It spoke of an enduring truth, that rest and peace often arrive in the most unassuming forms, carried softly on the simple, shared act of lying down. As he gently closed his eyes, he recognized that perhaps, in the slow rhythm of night, true solace was woven into the very imperfection of his humble beginnings, resting quietly, patiently, into the dawn of another day. Aldrich's day began quietly, with the faint glow of dawn filtering through a small, grated window into the modest bedchamber. He stood slowly, feeling the rough texture of his straw mattress beneath him, a humble foundation that felt both familiar and inadequate in the early morning stillness. The air was cool and dry, carrying the scent of old linen and distant smoke, as the promise of warmth seemed a distant hope. His thoughts drifted slowly, contemplating the simple act of getting ready, pulling on a rough spun tunic, smoothing the patchy linen sheets. There was no rush, only a gentle acknowledgement that his modest bed was a silent witness to many such mornings. Quietly tired, too. Later, in the bustling market square, the clatter of wooden looms and the hum of conversation filled the air, transforming everyday labor into a slow, rhythmic symphony. Aldrich wandered among the weavers, their hands expertly twisting, knotting, and weaving wool into thick blankets, and linen into soft sheets. The fabrics, though imperfect, offered a subtle sense of progress, warmth in winter's chill, and dignity in a simple home. Amidst the smell of damp wool and the faint sheen of spun silk, he observed the careful effort to balance comfort with hygiene, a challenge that seemed both relentless and quietly inspiring. Yet the trade was still young, fragile in its ambition, and uncertain in its reach. Irony hovered like a shadow in the marketplace as the weaver's skill was praised, but their wool remained rough, and their linen often coarse, a testament to human imperfection. Some of the blankets sagged or unraveled after a few washings, and the linen sheets, though smooth to the touch, stubbornly carried filth and odors despite washing, an unspoken reminder that cleanliness was a slow, often thwarted pursuit. Aldrich chuckled quietly to himself, watching a merchant boast about the finest fabrics, while unseen, their faces blurred in the late afternoon light. The prophets, whose images remained hidden behind veiled shadows. These humble textiles, in aspiration, but flawed in reality, made him wonder if comfort was ever truly attainable, or merely a fleeting illusion. As evening fell, Aldrich returned to his chamber, the weaving sounds fading behind the quiet rustle of new linen sheets and woolen blankets laid carefully over the bed. He ran his fingers over the soft, tattered edges, finding a strange reassurance in their modest presence. The room was now cloaked in calm, the day's effort settling into quiet acceptance. Though the fabrics were neither perfect nor opulent, they provided a simple dignity, proof that even the humblest of spaces could be elevated, however slowly, by patience and persistence. Outside, the sky darkened, and the world outside seemed to drift off as softly as his breathing. Each quiet moment, a subtle reminder of human resilience in routine. In the stillness of night, Aldrich reflected upon the journey from rough straw to handmade wool and linen, realizing that the evolution of his bedchamber mirrored human effort, imperfect yet persistent. The textiles that cloaked his bed, humble as they were, represented not just warmth or cleanliness, but the slow rise of craft, trade, and quiet dignity. Perhaps, in these modest improvements and muted ironies, lay a deeper truth. Comfort was not a final crown, but an ongoing, gentle process that connected everyone through simple acts of care. As sleep took him softly, he murmured to himself, a faint smile touching his lips at the small, enduring humanness of it all. In the quiet aisles of some medieval chamber, Aldrich, a young servant, paused to examine the rough straw mattress laid before him. The scent of hay mingled with the cool air, and he brushed his hand lightly over the coarse surface, feeling the imperfections beneath. Life was simple then, with sleep measured by the vigils of the night, and the earthly comfort of straw which, though humble, was considered adequate and familiar. One tranquil evening, a wandering merchant, bundled in wool and carrying a small leather pouch, happened to cross paths with Aldrich as he cleaned the humble pallet. Their silent exchange was brief, but meaningful, like two quiet ships passing in a calm sea. It was during this chance encounter that the merchant spoke softly of a new kind of fill, down from the waterfowl, which promised softness beyond the roughness of straw. His words painted images of warmth and gentle support, voices almost hushed by the evening hush. Aldrich listened, intrigued, but unsure. Stray strands of doubt flickered in his mind. How could such delicate feathers possibly support a human body comfortably? Yet, the seed of curiosity was planted, sparking a quiet rivalry in his thoughts between tradition and the allure of new luxury. The idea of a pillow that felt like a cloud against the cheek seemed, absurdly, a distant dream for men like him. In the days that followed, the notion of feathers versus straw became a whispered debate among villagers and chambermaids, each side clinging to their old ways or flirting with the promise of finer comfort. Some snorted at the merchant's idea, dismissing it as frivolous fancy, an unnecessary luxury for those who could scarcely afford the simplest bed. Meanwhile, others, drawn by the promise of softness and the faint glow of sophistication, began to secretly experiment, stuffing small scraps of feathers into old cloth. The irony settled gently. A material so fragile could somehow carry the weight of human longing, even as its advocates struggled against the weight of tradition. The humble straw remained the staple, but the idea of a feather pillow hummed quietly in the background. By mid-season, the chamber's simplicity persisted, yet beneath it, a subtle shift was underway. A few beds were lined with plump, feather-filled cushions, their surfaces flickering gently as they caught the early evening light. Aldrich, now more watchful, observed with mild amusement as some servants eagerly swapped their rough pillows for the softer ones, their faces smoothing into expressions of contentment and mild surprise. The feather pillows were light but palpable, offering a fragile promise of rest that was almost shy in its delicacy. The village's quiet acceptance of this minor change seemed to carry an unspoken acknowledgement. Comfort was somehow woven into the very fabric of gentle innovation, however slow its progress. In the end, Aldrich returned to his simple straw mattress each night, but with a small, knowing smile. The debate over feathers was no longer silenced, merely mellowed into a shared understanding that comfort, like many human pursuits, was a matter of patience and small steps. Perhaps, he thought, true rest wasn't in the richness of the fill, but in the quiet acceptance of human imperfection. The blurred faces of monks, prophets, and elders who might have judged such luxury faded into the gentle dim of memory, an afterthought amid the stillness of the chamber's calm. Sleep, after all, was the same gentle voyage, whether on straw or feather, an ordinary journey shared quietly by all who sought a moment of peace amid the endless rhythm of daily life. In the quiet hallways of the castle, Aldrich's vision of comfort was a humble hope, a soft, warm lair to ease the chilly nights and weary bones. The straw mattress had served its purpose for years, creaking with every shift and squelching slightly when pressed. It was simple, functional, and honestly a little dull. But it was enough, or so everyone believed, until the promise of something softer whispered into men's dreams. When news spread that a new feather duvet had arrived, a luxury crafted from distant bird down, the castle's chambers seemed to hold their breath, caught between curiosity and skepticism. That evening, as lanterns flickered faintly against stone, A quiet sense of expectancy settled softly over the estate. The ordinary was about to become extraordinary. Or so it appeared in the slow unfolding of human desire for more comfort. The grand feast that night was meant to unveil the duvet's debut, with many nobles and servants gathered in the candlelit hall. The fabric spread out on a gilded tray, and eyes flickered with a mixture of hope, humor, and gossip, each person weighing its weight in feathers and promise. As hands hesitantly touched the plush surface, murmurs of admiration and suspicion mingled, their voices unhurried and calm. Yet beneath the polite appraisal snaked a subtle tension. What if this new comfort was more than just a luxury? What if it symbolized status, power, or even vanity? The debate wandered quietly between practicality and pride, drifting as softly as the feathers themselves, casting a faint irony over the scene, as humans seemed ever drawn to adorn their rest with something both fragile and fleeting. In the days that followed, the duvet became a silent character within the castle's routines, a source of quiet contention and gentle humor. Servants teased each other about stealing a moment underneath the plump, shifting layers, while the nobles puffed out their chests, pretending not to covet a piece of the soft promise. The mattress beneath, once unremarkable, now seemed to hold a secret smirk, aware, perhaps, of the fuss it inspired. The perceived importance of this simple bedding revealed the curious human tendency to seek comfort as a symbol of status, easily elevating an ordinary object into a measure of power. Meanwhile, shadows played softly on the curtains, and the castle's hearth crackled as if amused by the quiet absurdity unfolding in its timeless walls. Eventually, as seasons changed and the novelty waned, the feather duvet found its place neither as a treasure nor a hindrance, but simply as part of the slow ritual of daily life. People retreated into their routines, comfort settling imperceptibly into the fabric of the castle's quiet existence. The duvet, once an object of lively debate, now lay still and smooth, awaiting the next restless night, the next breath of wind that made feathers shift in gentle silence. The strange ceremony of its debut faded into a calm acceptance, reminding everyone that human desires often oscillate between longing and indifference, both equally fleeting. In the end, no one truly owned the duvet. It merely shared their nights with subtle grace, quietly asserting its gentle, unassuming presence. Looking back, the arrival of the feather duvet was a small chapter, neither revolutionary nor tragic, but quietly meaningful in its own understated way. It served as a mirror to human nature, always reaching for comfort, eager to dress the mundane with symbols of prestige, yet ultimately part of the slow, unremarkable march of daily life. As the castle's chambers grew darker and the world outside moved on, the soft, quiet hum of that night's debate lingered, faint as a memory, brief as a breath. It was a reminder that even in the pursuit of comfort, human stories tend to settle into calm acceptance, their absurdities drifting softly into sleep, just as the castle itself drifted into night's gentle embrace. In the quiet corners of the medieval bedchamber, the early attempts at comfort seemed almost tentative. Straw mattresses lay softly, yet unassuming, filling the space with a dull, earthy scent. These crude pads cradled bodies through countless nights, whispering stories of simplicity and necessity, as if to gently remind one of life's humble essentials. The flickering candlelight flickered shadows across rough-hewn wooden panels, casting everything in a muted glow that made sleep feel like a slow, deliberate act. It was in these modest settings that humans first shaped their wishes for restful respite, unaware of the quiet evolution that lay ahead. Sleep was an act of patience, time stretching as the night wore on, holding stories of everyday perseverance in every sigh and shift. As centuries passed, the humble straw mattress grew in both thickness and expectation. Yet beneath this superficial change, tensions quietly simmered. Craftsmen experimented with softer fillings, often struggling to find balance, feathers down, or wool, each promising better comfort, but also bringing new worries about warmth and maintenance. The air in the chamber grew restless with these innovations. Comfort threatened to become a source of discomfort, as humans debated the best way to stay warm without becoming too heavy or too fragile. The lighting, ever flickering, seemed to underscore the uncertainty, things changing slowly, yet with a palpable sense of unresolved questions about what constitutes true comfort. In this gentle unrest, the bedchamber became a mirror of human desire and doubt, one feathered step at a time. Ironically, as the layers of bedding multiplied, so did the complexities. Feathers, once treasured for their lightness, now seemed to carry a new burden of absurdity. The bustling market stalls boasted stuffed duvets and layered mattresses, each more elaborate than the last, while the faces behind the fabrics remained half hidden, blurred by shadow or light. The stories of these transformations often carried a quiet humor, how a simple need for sleep had turned into a small, ornate craft industry, full of uneven stitching and misplaced feathers. The human pursuit of comfort, it seemed, could never quite match the poetry of a bed built with modesty in mind. And yet, in the midst of this quiet frenzy, sleep persisted, calmer now, as if the bedchamber itself had resigned to its slowly shifting, slightly absurd role as a sanctuary of small human hopes. Eventually, many chambers settled into a tranquil rhythm, where the feather duvet became a gentle, familiar presence, soft, warm, and unpretentious. Time gently smoothed the rough edges of those earlier struggles. The bed was no longer a battlefield of materials, but a peaceful refuge for nightly rest. The soft rustle of bedding in the cool night air became a lullaby to those who lingered in slumber, while the silent witnesses, those blurred, unseen figures, seemed to nod in quiet approval. Borders between practicality and indulgence blurred, much like the gentle folds of bedding itself. In this calm, human beings found a familiar rhythm, an acceptance that simple comfort, after generations of effort, could be enough. Here, amidst the gentle layers, the bedchamber finally became a small temple of repose, quietly marking its own humble legacy. Now, long after these quiet revolutions, Aldrich, the seasoned steward, looks back on those slow, often amusing changes with a gentle smile. He remembers how a straw mattress once sat on a cold wooden frame, and how the feathers, so fragile and elusive, morphed into bulky, cozy duvets. These moments reveal a subtle truth, that human beings, in their small ways, constantly seek comfort, unaware of how often they merely recreate what was always within reach. The stories of bedding, etched into the slow unfolding of history, serve as a reminder of patience, of how every small change, however mundane, shapes the quiet spaces where life happens. In the end, perhaps these tiny revolutions in comfort are just the slow, gentle breath of a past that still whispers softly in the corners of our beds. And so, Aldrich records it all, ensuring that future generations remember the subtle irony of human comfort, always striving, never quite reaching perfection, but gently settling into it nonetheless. As the evening shadows lengthened over the quiet village of Wormford, young Ealdred marched homeward, his footsteps sinking softly into the frosted earth. The air was brisk, but still, carrying the faint scent of burning wood and damp wool. Upon reaching the communal hall, he paused to observe the flickering glow from within, where Freya was already tending to the fire, her movements slow but purposeful. The others had gathered in their layered cloaks and rough-spun garments, huddling close as the darkness outside pressed in with a cold patience. That first moment of arrival felt like a quiet acknowledgement of winter's steady claim, a ritual of arriving back into warmth amid the biting silence of the season. Soon, a subtle tension rippled through the room, as the cold seemed to seep through the cracks and linger in the bones of those present. The villagers exchanged muted glances, adjusting their heavy cloaks and pulling their hoods tighter around their faces, each feeling the weight of the darkness pressing inward. The hearth's crackle grew more insistent, as if fighting an unseen, cold adversary, while the shivering of hands betrayed the effort to keep warmth. Stories were stifled, replaced by the quiet sounds of ruffled fabrics and the sighs of breath fogging in the air. In this fragile moment, the vulnerability of human flesh against winter's chill was plainly evident, yet somehow quietly accepted. Amidst the flickering firelight, a hint of irony softened the mood. Everyone's layered garments, thick and woven for warmth, seemed oddly insufficient against the relentless cold outside, as if the very act of dressing in winter clothes was a playful defiance of nature's indifference. Freya, with her face blurred by the dim glow, adjusted her hood with a sigh that sounded more weary than resigned, while some villagers chuckled softly at the absurdity of their bulky clothes. The communal effort to combat the darkness and cold felt both sincere and mildly humorous, a human tradition that clung stubbornly despite its obvious limitations. Here, in these simple layers, the thin veneer of comfort was both practical and painfully human, fragile but persistent. Gradually, the tension melted into a state of quiet calm as everyone settled into the slow rhythm of winter's night. The fire's glow grew steadier, casting soft shadows that danced minimally on the rough-hewn walls, and the villagers relaxed into their layered garments, resigning to the dark and cold outside. The room was filled with the gentle sounds of breathing, the soft crackle of burning wood, and the faint rustling of wool against wool. Outside, the wind whispered against the walls, but within, the warmth cultivated by layers and shared quiet seemed enough, not absolute, but enough to carry the night. In these moments, there was an almost peaceful acceptance of the enduring cold, as if the human necessity for warmth extended far beyond the physical, into community and memory. As the night wore on, reflecting on the scene, one might see how the effort to keep warmth alive was less about material comfort and more about the quiet persistence of human routines. The villagers, with their simple garments and flickering hearth, embodied a patience that felt both profound and mildly humorous, battling darkness with layered cloth and slow, weary rituals. Faces blurred in the firelight, their expressions peaceful yet tired, suggesting that even in times of hardship, a subtle humor and resilience persist beneath the surface. This ordinary act of gathering in the dark, with its flawed garments and flickering flames, narrated a deeper story of humans trying to hold onto warmth, both literal and metaphorical, through endless, delicate seasons. As dusk settled over the quiet village, Ealdred and Freya sat by the flickering fire, contemplating the dark ahead. Their hands rested on rough-hewn wooden slats, the weight of winter's approach settling in their bones as they brushed through scraps of wool and fur. An elder's voice, blurred and timeless, drifted faintly from the shadows, recounting age-old rites that blessed each layer of clothing, an act of quiet reverence toward survival. The cold seeped in, uninvited yet familiar, as they prepared to craft the garments that would shield them through many nights. In these slow, deliberate moments, a shared calm settled, tempered by the slow acknowledgement of human fragility amid accumulated tradition. But as they moved to the loom, tension crept in. The village's fleece reserves had thinned, and the usual supply of soft, fresh wool was gone, leaving them to consider stranger improvisations, woven from less perfect fibers or odd patches of old fabric. Freya's fingers hesitated over a twisted strand of discarded fleece, her brow knitting with quiet concern. The elder's voice, now faint and softly amused, recounted how their ancestors had faced similarly shortages, relying on patience and cunning to persevere. The ritual became uncertain, the familiar process marred by scarcity, highlighting the fragile reliance on tradition amidst the quiet sting of practical limits. Still, with gentle resolve, they pressed on, weaving hope into thread. The irony hung gently in the air, frowning at the patchwork of new and old, their clothing now a quiet testament to resourcefulness rather than pure craft. The fur-lined cloak, once a symbol of assured warmth, looked patched and imperfect. It seems uneven and slightly askew. Ealdred chuckled softly, the corners of his eyes crinkling at the modest absurdity of their efforts, while Freya's smile flickered briefly with humorous resignation. The elder's voice, obscured now by a shadowed outline, offered a calming story of resilience. But even tales of sacred rites couldn't entirely mask the knotted worry beneath. As the night deepened, their shared quiet humor softened the tension, turning necessity into a quiet camaraderie that needed no perfection. By the time they finished, a hush settled, and the community's makeshift garments stretched, brushed, and settled into their familiar place on each body, clothes humbling in their modesty, yet full of stories. The air grew calmer. The frost that had threatened their resolve now softened into a gentle, persistent chill that the patched garments struggled to banish fully. Ealdred and Freya, wrapped in their improvised layers, leaned into this steady rhythm of adaptation, their faces tired but peaceful, accepting the quiet wisdom of their ancestors. The elder's old voice, though still shadowed and blurred, now echoed a subtle reminder that human effort, imperfect as it may be, carries upon it the weight of countless nights lived and endured. In this slow dance of warmth and weariness, a faint but lasting sense of calm crept into the dark. Later, as they rested in the modest light of dawn. Ealdred and Freya reflected quietly on their humble journey, on how clothing and rituals, worn thin but held together by hope, defined the human attempt to tame the dark. They saw that, despite shortages and improvisations, their shared patience carried them through, binding tradition with necessity in a silent, enduring friendship with the night. The elder's blurred face seemed to smile gently from the shadows, acknowledging perhaps that the true warmth had always been in the quiet, recurring act of trying. Warmed not just by their cloaks, but by the slow understanding that survival, much like storytelling, was an ongoing, imperfect art. And so they watched another night fall with gentle acceptance, waiting patiently for the light that would come again. As dusk fell over the village, the villagers prepared for their nightly gathering. The faint glow of a single fire flickering in the cool air. Cloaks were pulled tight around shoulders, and quiet hums of anticipation drifted through the stillness as gentle hands arranged stones and stitched small fabrics for added warmth. The ceremony was a calm, familiar routine, softly unfolding under the settling darkness, with faces blurred by the dim light, neither fully seen nor forgotten. It felt like a moment suspended, the shared quiet holding the night at bay, even as the wind whispered warnings of cold approaching. Humanity's simple act of lighting a fire and whispering words to unseen gods felt, in its way, both fragile and steadfast, a gesture against the vast indifference of night. As the midnight hour approached, a sudden chill seeped into the gathering, tangible and uninvited, twisting through the layers of cloaks and into the bones beneath. The flames wavered, sputtering in resistance to the sharp, unexpected cold snap, and the low chants faltered into uncertain murmurs. Eyes looked up nervously at the darkness overhead, as if the stars themselves had grown colder and perhaps less willing to lend their light. Fingers tightened around the edges of woven fabrics, and voices, now slightly strained with effort, continued their rhythmic cadence. For a moment, the ritual teetered on the edge of the mundane and the urgent, just a shared human attempt to hold back the dark, and the irony of fire's fragility in the face of winter's surprise. A faint ripple of soft humor passed through the group, as some participants, half smiling in the gloom, started exchanging their thicker cloaks, an unspoken acknowledgement that even their effort to stay warm had become a little absurd. The sacred flames, now struggling, cast elongated shadows across faces that seemed to wear the same expressions of mild irony and gentle patience. The unseen, blurred faces of the old gods, if they existed, seemed to watch with detached amusement, their presence barely felt beyond the flickering shadows. The participants retreated into a quiet, collective resignation, an understanding that human warmth and fire could always be challenged by the stubborn march of winter. The ritual, ongoing, folded into a small acknowledgement of imperfection, a reminder of human limits amid the vast coldness of the dark. Gradually, a calm settled over the group as they adjusted their cloaks and leaned closer toward the still dying flames. The cold, now less sharp, more like an old, lingering companion. The murmurs of chants resumed softer, more deliberate, trying to coax the fire back to life. Much like humans coaxed meaning from their routines in the quiet dark, the air grew still, and the shadows cast gentle, endless patterns that blended into the fragile night. Faces, now partially illuminated by the smoke-gray glow, carried a kind of peaceful acceptance, as if these tiny sacrifices of warmth and faith were enough to keep the dark from fully swallowing them. It was in this quiet ritual, amid problem and patience, that they found the slow, unspoken hope that warmth could, somehow, persist against the odds. In the soft, subdued light of dawn, the villagers returned to their modest homes, carrying the faint memory of the night. They had faced the cold and a flickering fire, weathered through shared quiet humor and mutual effort. Cloaks hung slightly more wrinkled. Faces seemed a touch more tired, but also quietly content, as if they had, in some small way, kept the darkness at bay, not perfectly, but earnestly. The ritual, the exchange of cloaks, the muted chants became a gentle story of imperfection, a reminder that human warmth often thrived not in perfection, but in persistence. And as the day unfolded with its ordinary, unremarkable tasks, the night quietly relinquished its hold, waiting patiently for the next time humans would gather, cautiously hopeful, in the dark once more. As dusk settled over the thatched cottages, villagers prepared for another long night, bundled in layers of thick wool and linen that felt stiff and comforting against the growing cold. The flickering light of the hearth cast long shadows, and inside each humble home, quiet routines unfolded, ears warming by the fire, hands busy with simple tasks. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whispering through the narrow gaps in wooden walls, hinting at the severity of the coming storm. Despite their familiarity with the winter's harshness, there was a gentle awareness that tonight's darkness would stretch longer and colder than most. Humanity, in its quiet resilience, simply paused, waiting for dawn's uncertain promise to arrive again. Suddenly, a fierce blizzard swept through the village, battering the thatch roofs with icy gusts and muffling the world outside under a blanket of white. The fire in the hearth sputtered and flickered as its glow waned, shadows climbing up the walls, threatening the warmth and safety they had relied upon. In these tense moments, Freya remembered an old, almost forgotten rite, the ritual of pinning wolf pelts flat against the walls, a silent hope cast into the winter's wrath. The villagers gathered, layered in their most numerous clothing, the fabric rustling softly as they moved. They whispered prayers that sounded more like mindful breaths, grasping at the fragile thread of hope amid the relentless cold. All sensed quietly that they were fighting not just frost, but the very edge of survival itself. Irony settled quietly into the night as the villagers, wrapped in their heavy, layered garments, looked more like figures in a sluggish, sleepy procession than warriors against the winter's fury. Someone chuckled softly at the absurdity of their efforts. Their clothes, piled on like tiny armor, hardly seemed enough against the wind's hunger. The wolf pelts they had pinned to the walls now looked more like faded trophies, their fur matted and thin, mirroring perhaps their own waning fire of resistance. Still, they maintained their stance, their prayer-like murmurs mingling with the creak of frozen wood, a muted act of defiance wrapped in mundane routines. Humanity's modest stubbornness, it seemed, could often reveal itself in such quietly ironic ways, a testament to the minor battles fought each night. With the storm gradually easing, a sense of calm settled softly over the village, the winds howling reduced to distant echoes. Inside, the fire was small but steady now, its glow casting a gentle amber light that warmed faces and worn clothing. The villagers exhaled slowly, their bodies adjusting to the shifting cold, their layered garments offering a quiet shield that needed no praise. Freya, eyes half closed, observed the muted tableau, clothing, hearth, and the faint silhouette of the wolf pelts on the wall, each element quietly bearing witness to a night survived. As the darkness receded, the sense of exhaustion, or perhaps resignation, settled into their bones, a peaceful acknowledgement that the cold was a companion, not an enemy to be conquered, but endured in stillness. There was no heroism tonight, only the simple act of holding on against the darkness. Looking back, the villagers recognized that the true warmth had always come from their shared routines, the layered clothing, the ritual of guiding a flame through its final breaths, and the silent, collective act of enduring. The blurred faces of prophets and unseen deities faded into the hushed shadows, while their own small, imperfect efforts formed the fabric of survival. In these quiet nights, humanity's patience revealed itself in ordinary gestures, wrapping in wool, pinning pelts with care, whispering soft prayers to no particular god. As dawn finally touched the horizon, they lingered in the calm, silently grateful for another night of life's slow perseverance. Perhaps, they mused, comfort was no more than this, knowing the cold would come again, and having just enough to keep it at bay until the morning. As dawn edged its way cautiously through the small, battered windows of the village huts, the surviving inhabitants began their slow awakening. The night had been long and cold, filled with the distant sounds of shifting logs and muted whispers of shared discomfort. Inside the rough-spun cloaks and patched blankets, community members stirred quietly, acknowledging in their own subtle ways that the darkness had tested them, yet did not wholly defeat. The air was tinged with a faint trace of smoke from the lingering fires, now dim but still flickering with the promise of warmth that had sustained them through the coldest hours. It was, perhaps, an unspoken understanding that though the night was unforgiving, it could also be endured together, with patience and shared effort. Once the sun finally cast a gentle, amber glow over the battered rooftops and uneven fields, the villagers emerged with movements slow and deliberate. Their breath formed fleeting clouds in the crisp air as they inspected the damage from the storm, their hands brushing over rough wooden beams and mended patches of fabric. The faint hum of their voices carried a quiet resilience, an acknowledgement that survival hinged on communal effort and simple routines. Under the pale light, they lit small fires in portable, basic hearths, their flickering flames casting long, soft shadows that seemed to worship the fragile peace. Here, amidst the scattered debris and worn clothing, was a fragile sense of renewal born from endurance. In the dull, early morning haze, some villagers chuckled softly about their failed attempts at staying warm, pointing at mise-sized cloaks and patched-up boots with a weary humor that bordered on irony. A father tugged at his layered cloak, which sagged in spots, while children shivered in their makeshift shirts, their small faces half hidden beneath hoods too loose or too patched. The modesty of their clothing, often patched or frayed, hinted at the humbling reality. Their garments had become both armor and reminder of their imperfect efforts to keep the cold at bay. Yet, amid the monotony of repairs and shared muffled laughter, they found a strange comfort, an acceptance that no one was perfect, and warmth was always a collective, imperfect pursuit. As the sun climbed higher, the villagers settled into their routines, wrapping themselves in their humble attire, and settling near fires that now crackled with a slow, steady rhythm. The early light revealed their faces, surprised, bored, mildly amused expressions that often stayed the same no matter the hour. Their clothing, deliberately simple, told stories of practicality and resilience, woven through generations like quiet lessons. The air grew warmer, the bones less chilled, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible sense of calm settling, as if the storm's lessons had seeped into every fold of their garment and every shared glance. Life pressed forward, slow and measured, wrapped in the soft comfort of ordinary routines. Looking back on those days, it becomes clear that the true lesson wasn't merely in staying warm or repairing clothing, but in the subtle, persistent act of community. How shared purpose and modest ritual created a quiet kind of endurance. Those mornings, with their battered clothes and tired faces, reflected a collective acknowledgement that human imperfection was part of the process. The invisible threads of kinship, stitched through patchwork garments and mutual support, endured long past the last flicker of firelight. Chill and fatigue remained, yet so did a gentle faith in resilience, an unspoken understanding that warmth persisted not just in fires or clothing, but in the slow, steady continuation of life itself, imperfect and quietly meaningful. In the quiet corners of Castle Ravensgate's stone wing, Lady Elinnor's eyes drifted with a certain careful expectation as she stepped into her newly assigned chambers. The cool, rough texture of the walls seemed indifferent to her curiosity, yet her gaze settled upon the vast, unfinished fireplace that dominated one corner, its emptiness a promise of warmth, yet to be fulfilled. Somehow, the hearth's massive presence felt both reassuring and faintly absurd, like a silent guardian waiting patiently for its nightly ritual to begin. She brushed her fingers against the cold stone, sensing that this simple structure would soon shape her evenings in a way she hadn't anticipated. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she recognized that the glow of a fire could chase away the chill of stone and solitude, but also wondered how mundane this ritual would turn out to be day after day, fire after fire. As Lady Elinnor's first evening settled in, she met Master Mason Aldrich in the dimming twilight, his weathered face partly obscured by the shadow of a heavy brow, yet somehow familiar in his careful explanations. He pointed to the crisscrossing stones that formed the hearth's core, his voice low but steady, describing the layers of flint and timber that would be kindled each night, an ancient, repetitive dance of flame and ash. The reality settled around her like a quiet fog. This was no grand festival, but a daily necessity, a ritual she could not refuse, no matter how small it seemed. The irony floated in the air that this modest act was destined to define her nights more than any grandeur or gilded ornament ever could. All at once, she felt the faint hum of inevitability, a tiny human act embedded in the fabric of the castle's quiet life. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Lady Elinor watched as Aldrich prepared the hearth with studied patience. stacking what appeared to be simple dry twigs and small logs. Yet there was a care in his movements that bordered on reverence. She chuckled softly, realizing how absurd it was that such a small pile of wood could hold so much importance. Yet how true it was that these humble bits would hold her stories, her fears, her comfort. The flames flickered with tentative life once ignited, casting soft shadows that played against the worn tapestry and her own mildly amused expression. There was a peculiar dignity in this act, a quiet, unremarkable heroism in tending the fire that would keep her warm, safe, and somehow still herself. And as the fire settled into a gentle glow, she was struck by how little had changed in centuries. Just a woman and her hearth, caught in a timeless dance of light and shadow. In the faded glow of the hearth's steady warmth, Lady Elinor found a strange sense of calm settling over her, an almost meditative lull that softened the edges of her day's worries. The crackle of the fire seemed to carry its own quiet joke, a slow, sleepy whisper that suggested human life was often just about waiting for the flames to die down, waiting for dawn, waiting for the next evening's ritual. She listened to the faint rustling of the logs, the soft cooing of her own breath mingling with the smoky scent that lingered in the air. This simple, repetitive task, she realized, had become a small anchor amid the chaos of courtly life, a humble reminder that control often resides in tiny acts. The fire's glow was neither grand nor dull. It simply was, quietly binding her to her moments and a slower time. Later, as her eyelids grew heavier with the comfort of warmth and faint flickering light, Lady Elinor reflected on how a single hearth could embody so much security, routine, even a hint of human dignity. She wondered how many others had sat through similar nights, tending fires with a mixture of necessity and hope, perhaps with a trace of shared irony at the simplicity of it all. In the shadows of her chamber, the faintest glow of the hearth was a soft echo of continuity, of small moments stitched into the vast, slow fabric of castle life. She realized that in tending the fire, she was part of something much larger than herself, a quiet tradition that held time at bay, if only for a little while. With a gentle sigh, she let the fire's warmth lull her toward sleep, the tiny, steady light a reminder of human persistence, simple, imperfect, human, and altogether enough.